Welcome to Babblecom 5. This is episode 17 of season 5 of Babylon 5, Movements of Fire and Shadow. We jump straight into a Centauri-Drazi firefight as Vorchans engage Sunhawks at Draxis on the edge of Drazi space. As capable as the Sunhawks are, the Vorchans have a few tricks up their sleeve, deploying some form of hunter-seeker mines that detonate on contact with the enemy ships, whilst their forward cannons lay down fire. Lockley narrates that the Centauri are out of control and effectively at war with everyone, which has resulted in Centauri deaths on the station, as we see Franklin going to check on a victim. While she's deployed security, it hasn't particularly helped, and she may have to take steps to quarantine Centauri away from the other races. She stops recording as Sheridan arrives to her quarters with more bad news. It seems the Centauri are targeting enemy jump gates, which are not normally considered fair game because they're essential to the maintenance of hyperspace travel using the beacon system. Wars come and go, but gates are supposed to remain. The station itself is on level 2 alert, with half its Furies in local space and the other half in hyperspace. Lockley doesn't anticipate an attack just yet, but says that could change when the White Stars engage. And it just did, because Sheridan's given the launch order. White Stars will now be supporting Alliance combat situations, and we see some joining the fray. And White Stars are something that Sheridan needs to speak to Delenn about, although he doesn't want to. Not the interesting things he bought her to wear, apparently. He says they've been throwing them at everything going from cruisers to destroyers over the course of several conflicts now, and now with the Centauri conflict. Ultimately, they're going to run out. Delenn agrees. Whilst they've proven very capable of taking on ships 5 or 6 times their size, they needed a destroyer-class White Star to even things up. However, it was the Grey Council who authorised the White Stars to be built for the Shadow War, and the ISA was lucky to inherit them. With the Shadow War over, the resources required to do something similar will be harder to justify. This is where John's plan comes in, a joint Earth-Minbari project, where Minbari design the ships and Earth funds and builds them. Earth gets new technology into the bargain, while Minbar does not have to lift a finger beyond the designs. The snag is, Earth won't say yes until they know the Minbari have said yes, and the whole thing has to be kept top secret until the first prototypes come off the assembly line. Which means Sheridan has to ask Delenn to go to Minbar to ask the Grey Council in person, and the route is in no way safe right now. Delenn chides him for being wary of asking her, because to live is to risk. She will leave as soon as possible. Veer has asked Lita and Franklin to come and visit him in his newly downgraded quarters, noting that the Drazi in particular are very strong fighters. According to Alliance principles, the bodies of the dead should be being returned, and the Centauri are doing so, but the Drazi are not, it seems. Veer feels Franklin and Lita could go to the Drazi homeworld and find out why, because Veer suspects there is something else at play, that perhaps the crews are not dead and are being pumped for information, or there are bodies, and Franklin could then establish whether they died in space or elsewhere. Franklin agrees to help, subject to the President's go-ahead, but Lita notes she hasn't said yes just because Franklin has said so. Her fee will be 500,000 credits, and she doesn't go until it's in the telepath funding account. Veer will need to figure it out and notes to Franklin that she's changed, which Franklin can't disagree with. At this suggestion that Veer speak to Londo about the extra funds, Veer notes that he's otherwise engaged at the moment, and so our scene shifts to Centauri Prime. Londo claims he is taking a stand by staying with Jakar, who thinks he should go, thinking it's an odd time for him to develop something approaching the moral equivalent of an opposable thumb. Ouch. They discuss how long they might have to stay holed up, Londo counting on popular opinion to give him sway politically and get him out. Just then there is a bright flash in the room out of nowhere, and they both crumple. A panel slides back and Londo is dragged out of the room, then transferred to a gurney. Aliens very closely resembling those we have seen operating on those receiving shadow implants examine him in detail, including the equivalent of an X-ray, until finally another alien appears, a Drach, and declares him sufficient. When he awakes, he is back in the cell with Jakar, who accuses him of having had a nightmare and snoring, making no reference to the events of the prior evening. Yet Londo knows something is deeply wrong beyond the war. He knows he now has to get out of the cell immediately, so Jakar hits upon a means to allow him out while saving face, and starts focusing on his evening meal. Londo and a guard cover their faces as they leave the cell, complaining about the smell from Jakar regurgitating said meal, Londo saying his buttons are melting. On the station, the Precari and Narn say the White Star's fleet involvement is helping them to hold their own against the Centauri attacks. Yet the Drazi won't assist them in their own space, despite having suffered fewer losses. The Alliance doesn't seem mature enough to support that degree of cooperation at this point. Sheridan parks that and asks what they think the Centauri's strategy is. No one seems to know. Garibaldi notes that they seem to be operating in two discrete ways, one defensive arm, one offensive arm, yet with no clear communication between the two. Just as Sheridan is calling this out as decidedly odd, Lockley is called up to C&C. Captain Natok of the Narn questions why they aren't being more active rather than reactive. Why should they not hit Centauri Prime when the Centauri have shown no qualms in attacking their civilian populations? Sheridan won't sanction that. He wants to attack their ability to fight. Cleanly. There is clearly a desire from the others to take the fight to them, no matter what. Lockley's situation deteriorates rapidly as long-range hyperspace probes detect a Centauri Vorchan cruiser with no life signs on approach to the jump gate, but its engines are approaching critical, weapons systems unarmed. Lockley realizes it's a berserker and orders Alpha Squadron already in hyperspace to take it out of the skies. It's intended to blow up inside the gate as it jumps into normal space, destroying the gate. It opens up a jump point, but Alpha Squadron are able to kill it before it can get into normal space fully, and Lockley has had the gate struts moved apart. The bulk of the explosion is channeled forward out of the jump point rather than expanding to the sides. In the aftermath, the Drazi fleet commander asks if the Narn commander will join him in an attack on Centauri Prime to try and end the war, and he agrees, having, as he puts it, no special love for the Centauri. The gate is damaged enough to prevent traffic through it for a few days, as Sheridan notes to Delenn en route to Minbar. He'd been worried about her, but should perhaps have been more worried about the station. He notes that at least Franklin is already on his way, which puzzles her. Sheridan thought she already knew. He clearly green-lighted their Drazi excursion, as our scene shifts to the Drazi homeworld. Lita and Franklin are struggling to find their way through the narrow streets of the Drazi homeworld, and although they have time before they meet their contact, it is apparent to us that their arrival has not gone unremarked. On Centauri Prime, the Defence Minister is adamant that their fleet is on a purely defensive footing despite what Londo is telling them. They will not back him against the Regent and leave. On the station, Garibaldi has run across to tell Sheridan in person that some 30% of the Drazi and Narn fleets have disappeared. Garibaldi figures they've left enough ships behind to guard their assets whilst the rest go for Centauri Prime, and they have a serious head start. Sheridan tells them to find the fastest White Star to use and get them out there to try and stop them before they inflict massive civilian casualties on the Centauri. Franklin and Lita get a visitor as they sweat it out on the Drazi homeworld. Whilst it's the doctor they've been expecting, Lita is immediately suspicious, and as he feeds them a tale of body parts too mangled to assemble, she accuses him directly, as Franklin notices a pair of Drazi abseiling onto their balcony and knocks Lita to the ground as they open up. He takes one down and Lita freezes the other, forcing his own weapon onto his head and firing. Franklin stops the doctor making an exit, and Lita scans him hard, her eyes widening and demanding that he take them there now, wherever there is. At the station, a fleet of White Stars has assembled with Sheridan commanding it, with an Atok still maintaining radio silence. They head out. Delenn and Lanier are 2 jumps out from Minbar when Lanier detects 4 Centauri warships in hyperspace with them, too many to fight. Delenn orders evasive maneuvers, but they've been detected, and as she orders a jump to normal space and a call to Babylon 5, they are hit by the initial barrage, blowing off a wing pylon and sending them tumbling into hyperspace. On the Drazi homeworld, the Doctor is trying to delay the pair, but Franklin threatens to sick Lita on him again. Finally, they arrive at a doorway, and in the large room it leads onto are not Centauri bodies, but strange black ovoids that Lita is drawn to, hearing a faint shadow ship scream from one as she runs her hand over it. The Doctor says this was all they found in the Centauri ships, hooked up to their control systems. Then a gun charges and he takes a shot to the chest. Lita grabs one of the devices as Franklin ushers her back out the way they came in. On Centauri Prime, Londo finds the Regent in his quarters, saying his time is almost up, but that he has He had promised to see him again before the end, and he tries to keep his promises to those who have been kind to him. Londo asks if he did give the orders to their ships, and he says he did after a fashion, or at least he did what he was able to do. He says Londo's time is almost upon him, and he's glad he won't live to see what follows. Lita and Franklin have managed to get through to Sheridan, with Lita identifying the pod as leftover shadow tech that the Vorlons warned her about. It's a telepresence unit used to control a starship from great distances. Place a few aboard a ship and it doesn't need a crew. So if the Centauri were given some, or a third party used them, Centauri ships could be operated without the main Centauri fleet being aware, which ties back to Garibaldi's identification of two separate Centauri fleets. More, it means that the strategy was never for a specific goal. The only goal was to pit the ISA against itself and encourage an attack on the Centauri. Sheridan asks them to keep trying to get through the jamming to Garibaldi and get themselves out because there are no white stars to spare at the moment. He orders his ship to pour it on in a desperate effort to get to Centauri Prime in time. As worried as he is about the population of Centauri Prime, we find that he should also be worrying about Delenn. Her white star is crippled, dead in hyperspace. Lanier's leg is broken, and he's established that he and Delenn are amongst very few survivors on the ship. No one else seems to be alive on the bridge, and no one else can get to them. Jump engines are offline, the distress signal might be working, and when their navigational thrusters run out of power, they will start drifting off beacon. Their situation is therefore very serious. We see a glimpse of the Drazi Narn fleet in hyperspace as Jakar writes in his cell. The Regent speaks with Londo as he moves to a window. He continues to refer to them, saying they told him many things he didn't understand or didn't want to understand. He says there will be peace for a time, but it won't last. They also said that he would be dead by morning, and Londo would be Emperor. Londo does not understand. The Regent tells him not to rush his last 3 hours. The Regent also says they asked him to do one more thing, the last thing they would ask him to do, and that he did it just before he came to speak to Londo. He sent away the ships guarding Centauri Prime on a false emergency and turned off the planetary defense network. He says it should be quite pretty as Londo backs away, horrified, and bolts from the room. In space, jump points form everywhere, and Drazi and Narn ships pour out and charge their weapons as Londo runs through the corridors of the palace out into the courtyard to see the last of the jump points closing. As he looks up, so too do Jakar and the Regent. Then the firing begins. Just having to calm down from both the episode and missing an auction I meant to bid on because I completely lost track of time because I was so engrossed in writing this. Whilst this episode lacks the scale of one like Severed Dreams, its sheer pacing is pretty ferocious, and it actually leaves us in a very dark place with a lot of unanswered questions about how the season might resolve itself. So let's start with Lita, who clearly got her money, and Franklin. It is, of course, delightfully ironic that Veer, in simply trying to bring dead bodies home, causes them to go on a mission that results in the whole situation being cracked wide open for Sheridan. As Lita notes, they've worked well together before, but here we see Lita developing a very ruthless streak because she didn't have to have the Drazi assailant kill himself. She could probably just have knocked him unconscious psionically. As it is, she overrode what must be a pretty strong self-preservation instinct around not shooting yourself in the head. Was her knowing what the devices were a bit too convenient? She mentions Psychor having seen one before, but not how she knows that, and also Vorlon implanted memories. The latter ties into what we know from Third Space in a sense, so that does track, although it seems like a very minor thing to have told her about. It all works in terms of the speed at which the episode runs, but it is something of an expositional piece nonetheless. It's noted that the Drazi see themselves as having a particular rivalry with the Centauri, so their desire to keep the shadow tech to themselves when they should have turned it over to the ISA does play into that. The war is actually in their interest, as Sheridan notes, because it weakens their rival. Yet in teaming up with the Narn, we now have two races who are going against what the ISA president has told them to do in refraining from hitting Centauri Prime in a generalised fashion. They seem to lack the sort of planet-killing tech the Centauri once employed against the Narn, but presumably they can knock out orbital assets and perhaps mount ground attacks from orbit, whilst Drazi ships have been seen to be atmosphere capable. None of this bodes well for the future of the ISA, of course, and reinforces why Sheridan and Delenn were looking to bolster their forces. The children are not playing nicely together even now. Whilst it was quite clearly foreshadowed heavily earlier in the episode, Delenn's ship being taken out that badly is quite shocking, and we know from many other episodes that if a ship drifts off beacon, the gravitational pulls in hyperspace will probably result in it being forever lost. This being said, the White Stars do have a self-repair functionality. I didn't recall Lanier saying it was out of commission, but the degree of damage to the ship might well be such that it too is offline. We also don't know if their distress signal is broadcasting, so really it's a pretty precarious position they find themselves in when all's said and done. So much for the straightforward courier run. It's a nice expectation subversion that Sheridan's fleet isn't anywhere to be seen by the end of the episode. It's also interesting that there's no hint here of Garibaldi having been under the influence this episode. He seems to be very functional. I'm not sure if this is because there wouldn't have been time to address it anyway, or because he just hasn't had a chance to hit the bottle with what's been happening. So that's perhaps a little up in the air, the only question being whether he did in fact spot the Narn and Drazi fleet's disappearance as quickly as he could have. Lockley finally turns up for duty again, and I'm slightly puzzled that there's no reference to Earth sending any ships in to help form up a fleet. Interesting that they want to help build new ships, certainly, and maybe post the Civil War they're feeling bruised too in terms of ship numbers. It's quite funny how they all react to her suggestion of consolidating forces, considering they have worked together in the Shadow War before now. Clearly they all figure they don't want to leave their own worlds open. I think Lockley deals with the kamikaze gate attack as well as might be expected, and it's a reminder that Babylon 5 is not beyond being attacked directly in such a conflict. G'Kar is primarily comic relief in this episode because clearly Londo is the recipient of some unauthorised probing, and that's what our attention is on. It's now more apparent than ever that the ex-Shadow crew are very much in the mix on Centauri Prime, given their ability to clandestinely abduct him and conduct examinations of him over an extended period. Not a sequence I remembered at all from my original watching through of the series. Then of course we have his very disturbing meeting with the poor Regent, who is now actually desperate for release from the position he's found himself in, and welcomes his imminent demise. The scenes that follow where he realises exactly what the Regent has just done, and what the implications are incredibly powerful, because he once managed to save his planet from this sort of attack. Now the wheel has turned full circle, and this time he's powerless to prevent it. And against all the odds, it's the Narn who are part of the firing squad, having clearly managed to salvage more of their Jaquan-class cruisers. Somewhat ironic that G'Kar now faces orbital bombardment by his own people. So all this leaves us in a very complex situation for the next episode. Sheridan has said he'll support military action by ISA members. Does the bombardment of Centauri Prime count? Or will he be forced to attack the combined Narn and Drazi fleet with the few White Stars he has? How will Delenn and Lanier be retrieved? What are the Shadow's allies' plans for Londo, assuming they do kill the Regent? How will the Centauri respond to the assault on their homeworld, and the new evidence tying their ships, if not their people, to the assaults on Alliance shipping? Bubbling away beneath the surface remain Lita's efforts to forge a new path for rogue telepaths, and her clear intention to tap into her Vorlon-given abilities. It remains a shame that we couldn't have gotten to this level of intensity a little earlier. It feels like a lot of this season was padding leading up to this crisis point, but I've discussed before why that is likely to have been the case. Taken in isolation, this is still a very strong episode, reminiscent of some of the best, and it leaves us wanting more without a doubt. And I shall bring you more in a week. Cheers for now.